Hello, my friend, and welcome to the Sleepy Scholar. Tonight, we are not going to talk about a place, or a person, or an idea. Tonight, we are going to talk about a world, a whole vanished world, colder and quieter than anything you have ever felt. One that lasted for tens of thousands of years and shaped the very body you are lying in right now. We are going to talk about the Ice Age, not as a fact to memorize, but as a feeling to sink into. What it would actually mean, moment by moment, to be a small, warm-blooded creature trying to survive inside it. And the strange, gentle truth we'll arrive at, again and again tonight, is that you, exactly as you are, soft and warm and safe under whatever is covering you right now, would not have lasted very long there at all. Not because you are weak, because that world was almost unimaginably hard, and the fact that anyone survived it, that your ancestors survived it, long enough to eventually make you, is its own kind of miracle. One we can rest inside of tonight. If you've had a long day, and most days are long in their own quiet way, you don't need cosmic mysteries or complicated ideas to carry you toward sleep. You just need somewhere else to rest your attention, somewhere far away and very old and utterly disconnected from your inbox, your to-do list, the versions of tomorrow your mind keeps rehearsing. Tonight, that somewhere is a frozen world, tens of thousands of years gone. So we're not going to rush. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing you need to remember by morning. We'll wander gently through the cold and the fire and the fur and the silence of that ancient time. And if you drift off before we're finished, that's not just allowed, that's the whole point. The story will still be here tomorrow, whenever you'd like to return to it. And if these gentle journeys into old, strange worlds help you find your way to sleep, you're welcome to like or subscribe. Not because it matters to the story, but because it might help some other sleepy soul stumble onto this same quiet corner of the internet on some night when they need it too. Now, before we go anywhere at all, let's take care of the body that's carrying you there. Let your shoulders drop just slightly away from your ears. You may not have noticed how long they've been holding on up there. Let them go. Let your jaw unclench. Let your tongue rest heavy and soft in your mouth. Let your forehead smooth out the way it does without you trying when nobody's watching. Let your breathing slow, not forced, just allowed. In and a little longer out. Again, whenever you think of it. Let your hands unclench too, wherever they are. Let your legs feel heavy, the good kind of heavy, the kind that sinks into the mattress instead of holding itself up. You don't need to follow every word I say from here forward. You don't need to remember any of it. You don't need to stay awake for the ending, because there isn't a test, there isn't a quiz, there is nothing here you have to hold on to. This is simply somewhere to rest your mind while your body does what it already knows how to do. So let your mind drift loosely, like something floating rather than something swimming, as we begin. Start with this, a bold, cold word, the Ice Age. It sounds like a single event, a single winter, something with a beginning and an end you could point to on a calendar. It wasn't. What we call the Ice Age was actually the most recent stretch of a much longer pattern, long cold periods called glacials, separated by shorter warm periods called interglacials. The whole rhythm repeating for millions of years, like a very, very slow breathing. The last glacial period, the one most people picture when they hear Ice Age, peaked around 20,000 years ago. At that point, ice sheets more than a mile thick, taller than most mountains you could name, sat on top of what is now Canada, Scandinavia, and much of northern Europe, simply because that much water had frozen solid and stayed that way for millennia. You live, right now, in an interglacial, a warm little pocket in that long, cold rhythm. The Ice Age isn't ancient history in the way the pyramids are ancient history. It's more like the resting state of this era of Earth, and we happen to be living in the exception. If you were dropped into the deep cold of that time, the first thing you would notice wouldn't be the mammoths or the glaciers. It would be your own skin. Bare human skin, unclothed, starts to feel serious discomfort within minutes in temperatures we'd now call merely chilly. And Ice Age winters in much of Europe and Asia often sat well below freezing for months on end, sometimes plunging far lower during cold snaps. Frostbite, real tissue-damaging frostbite, can begin on exposed skin in well under 30 minutes at temperatures that occurred routinely across huge stretches of that world. You have never had to think about your fingers the way an Ice Age human had to think about them. Right now, wherever your hands are resting, they are simply warm. That is not nothing. That is a small, constant miracle your body performs without asking for thanks. But that is only one small part of the story. Here's another quiet truth. You were not built to be cold. Compared to almost every other mammal that lived through the Ice Age, the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the Arctic fox, the reindeer, the human body arrived to that frozen world almost embarrassingly underdressed. No thick fur, no hibernation, no natural layer of blubber like a seal, just thin, mostly bare skin, evolved over millions of years in the warm grasslands of Africa to shed heat efficiently, not hold on to it. This wasn't a design flaw, exactly. It's part of what let early humans run long distances in the heat, sweating instead of panting, chasing prey to exhaustion under an African sun. But it meant that when humans pushed north into the deep cold of the Ice Age world, they were bringing a body built for the opposite problem. every single degree of warmth they needed had to be manufactured, borrowed, or stolen from fire, from the skins of other animals, from huddling close to one another in the dark. Your own body still carries this old inheritance. That's part of why cold feels, even now, like something urgent. Why your body still shivers, still tightens its blood vessels near the skin, still tries every ancient trick it knows the moment a room turns chilly. Tonight, wrapped in whatever softness is around you, you are simply not doing any of that ancient work. Your body gets to rest from a job it has been doing, in one form or another, for hundreds of thousands of years. There is something else worth resting on for a moment: fire. We think of fire today as something we summon instantly. A switch, a lighter, a low blue flame appearing the second we want it. For most of the Ice Age, fire was closer to a fragile, precious guest that had to be earned, tended, and never, ever allowed to go out. Making fire from nothing, using friction, or a spark struck from stone against stone, is slow, difficult, and often fails, especially with damp wood in a freezing world. Because of this, many groups of Ice Age humans didn't try to create fire from scratch every time. Instead, they kept it alive. A single fire, carried carefully from camp to camp, tended through the night by someone always awake to feed it. Sometimes kept burning for very long stretches, because losing it might mean days of dangerous cold before anyone could coax a new one to life. Imagine that responsibility. Not just staying warm yourself, but being, some nights, the one person keeping the only spark of heat alive for everyone you love. There was no backup fire in the next room, no fireplace waiting unused for when you needed it. There was one small, living thing made of light and warmth, and it depended entirely on people choosing, night after night, not to let it die. Tonight, warmth simply exists around you without anyone tending it. Let that be a small, quiet comfort. There is another layer to this cold world worth sitting with. Clothing wasn't clothing the way you think of it now. It was closer to survival engineering. Ice Age humans didn't just drape animal skins over themselves. Archaeologists have found bone needles, tiny, delicate-eyed needles carved from bone or ivory, some over 40,000 years old, which tell us something remarkable. These people were sewing, not wrapping, sewing, tailoring fitted garments, layered and windproof, designed the way a modern parka is designed, with attention to seams and insulation and fit. This mattered enormously, because loose, wrapped fur lets cold air sneak in at every gap, while fitted, layered clothing traps warm air against the body. The same principle your own winter coat still relies on today. Making these garments took extraordinary skill, scraping hides clean, softening them, cutting them precisely, sewing them with sinew thread pulled through tiny bone eyes, all by hand, all by firelight, all through cold that would make your fingers ache within minutes. A person without this skill dropped into the Ice Age with nothing but their bare human hands and modern-day cleverness would likely freeze long before they figured out how to make anything warm enough to matter. The knowledge of asterisk, how asterisk to survive the cold wasn't instinct. It was culture, technology, really, passed down, refined, and taught, generation after generation, the same way you might now be taught to tie a shoe or boil an egg, except the stakes were simply staying alive. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's talk gently about food, because this is where the Ice Age becomes even less forgiving. You have never truly known hunger the way it existed then. Not the mild, I should eat something hunger of a busy afternoon, but the deep, months-long scarcity that came again and again with late winter, after the stored fat from autumn's hunts had been slowly eaten away, and before spring brought the return of migrating herds and the first green shoots. Many researchers who study ancient diets refer to this stretch as something like a seasonal bottleneck, the hardest, leanest weeks of the year, when the margin between surviving and not surviving grew dangerously thin. During this window, small setbacks that would be minor inconveniences today, an illness that kept a hunter in camp for a week, an early spring storm, a herd that shifted its migration path slightly, could tip a whole group from hungry into genuine starvation. There was no grocery store to fall back on, no stored grain in a pantry, just what had already been gathered, dried, or frozen, stretched as thin as it could go. Your body, right now, has almost certainly never experienced true, sustained, months-long scarcity like that. Even on your leanest, busiest days, food is minutes away. Let that be another small thing to feel grateful for, quietly, as you drift. There's something else, stranger and more specific, worth resting on here. Fat mattered more than meat. You might imagine Ice Age humans as simply eating a great deal of protein, lean meat from whatever animal they'd managed to hunt. But protein alone, without enough fat or carbohydrate alongside it, is dangerous to survive on for long. The human liver can only process so much protein before it becomes toxic, a condition sometimes informally called rabbit starvation by later explorers who tried to survive on lean meat alone and found themselves growing weaker, not stronger, no matter how much they ate. Because of this, Ice Age humans prized fat almost more than meat itself, the marrow inside bones, the fatty organs, the blubber of seals and whales along the coasts. Cracking open a large animal's leg bone for the rich marrow inside wasn't a delicacy in the way we might think of it now. It was often the most calorically vital part of the entire kill, sometimes worth more, pound for pound, than the muscle meat surrounding it. This is part of why so many Ice Age hunts targeted the largest, fattest animals they could find, not just for the volume of meat, but because a single mammoth carried enough stored fat and marrow to matter enormously across a hard season, in a way that a dozen small, lean rabbits never could. There is something else worth resting on for a moment: the hunt itself. You've likely seen a cartoon version of this in your mind: a spear, a running mammoth, a triumphant kill. The reality was slower, more dangerous, and far more collaborative than that image suggests. Hunting an animal that could weigh 6 or 8 times what a car weighs, using only stone-tipped spears, required extraordinary coordination. Driving the animal toward a natural trap, like a bog or a cliff edge, working in groups, sometimes over hours, sometimes across days, with real and constant risk of injury or death to the hunters themselves. A single mistimed charge from a wounded, panicked mammoth could crush or gore a person instantly. There were no hospitals waiting nearby. A broken leg from a hunt gone wrong in a world without modern medicine could easily become a death sentence, not from the injury itself, but from the weeks of being unable to hunt, gather, or flee danger while it healed, if it healed at all. This is worth sitting with for just a moment. An activity we might now picture as a thrilling adventure was, for them, something closer to a calculated, communal gamble, enormous potential reward, set against enormous, very real risk, undertaken not for excitement, but because the alternative was slow starvation. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's turn, gently, to the ground beneath their feet and the shelters built upon it. In the coldest, most treeless stretches of the Ice Age world, the vast open plains of what's now Ukraine and Russia, wood for building simply didn't exist in any real quantity. So people built with what was abundant instead: bone. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of actual dwellings, constructed from the skulls, jaws, and long bones of dozens of mammoths, carefully stacked and arranged into circular, dome-like structures, likely covered over with hides for insulation. Imagine the labor in that. Not felling a few trees, but locating, transporting, and assembling the skeletal remains of dozens of enormous animals, bones that could each weigh as much as a grown adult, into something sturdy enough to survive brutal winds and snow loads through an entire winter. These weren't temporary lean-tos. Some show evidence of being used, repaired, and reused across multiple seasons, suggesting real, long-term investment in a single shelter. There is something quietly moving in this image. A home built, quite literally, from death, from the enormous, patient bodies of animals that once thundered across that same frozen plain, repurposed into the very thing that kept the next generation of humans alive through the winter. Nothing wasted, nothing thrown away. Everything, eventually, reused. Here's a smaller, sharper truth. A minor injury in that world was never truly minor. Think of the last time you had a small cut, a scraped knuckle, a mild fever. You likely thought about it for a few minutes, maybe cleaned it, and moved on with your day, barely worried. In the Ice Age, that same small wound carried a very real risk of infection with no antibiotics, no antiseptic, nothing beyond whatever plant knowledge or cleaning instinct a group happened to carry. An infected cut on the hand, a rotten tooth, a simple stomach bug. Any of these could, and regularly did, become fatal, not through any single dramatic event, but through slow, untreated decline. Skeletal evidence from this era shows this plainly. Signs of healed fractures alongside signs of infections that clearly weren't survived. Dental problems left to worsen for years. Injuries that speak to lives lived extremely close to the edge of what a body could endure and recover from unaided. Life expectancy at birth during this period is estimated by many researchers to have hovered somewhere in the 20s to 30s, a number pulled down heavily by high rates of death in infancy and childhood, but still reflecting a world where simply staying alive, year after year, was its own quiet, constant achievement. Tonight, whatever small aches or minor complaints your body carries, they are simply not the same category of danger they once were. That, too, is something to feel gently grateful for as you sink further down. But that is only one small part of the story. There's a gentler, more tender layer worth pausing on here. How children survived, or often didn't, in that world. Childhood in the Ice Age carried risks almost unimaginable to modern parents. Estimates drawn from skeletal remains and comparisons to more recent hunter-gatherer societies suggest that a very large portion of children, plausibly close to half, in the hardest environments, didn't survive to adulthood, lost to cold, illness, accident, or the same seasonal food scarcity that threatened everyone, but which hit smaller, more vulnerable bodies hardest of all. And yet, evidence suggests these were not communities where children were treated as expendable or unloved. Quite the opposite. Burial sites from this era have revealed children laid to rest with extraordinary care, adorned with beads, ochre pigment, carved ornaments, buried alongside items that clearly took real time and skill to make, suggesting deep grief and deep tenderness, not indifference, toward these losses. This is one of the more quietly devastating truths of that world. Love and loss existed in the same intense proportions we know now, but loss visited far, far more often. Every child who did survive to adulthood represented not luck alone, but an enormous, sustained effort from an entire group, feeding, warming, protecting, and teaching a small, fragile person through years where the margin for error was thin enough to be almost non-existent. Let's shift now toward towards something a little more hopeful. The astonishing adaptations some human groups actually developed to make that cold world survivable at all. The Neanderthals, who lived through earlier, equally brutal stretches of Ice Age cold across Europe and Western Asia, show clear physical adaptations to that climate in their very bones. Broader noses likely evolved to warm and humidify frigid air before it reached the lungs. Shorter limbs relative to their torsos, a shape that reduces the surface area through which body heat can escape. The same basic principle behind why smaller, stockier animals generally handle cold better than long, lean ones. Barrel-shaped rib cages, possibly supporting greater lung capacity to fuel the high metabolic demands of staying warm in extreme cold. These weren't choices. They were the slow, patient sculpting of evolution across hundreds of thousands of years. Each small adaptation offering just enough advantage in the cold to be quietly favored, generation after generation, until an entire population carried a body subtly, elegantly reshaped by the climate itself. Your own body carries none of these specific adaptations in the same intensity. Most modern humans descend primarily from populations that evolved in warmer climates and only later moved into the cold, bringing culture and technology rather than deep physical adaptation with them. It's a gentle reminder that survival in that world came in more than one form. Some populations adapted their bodies, others adapted their behavior, their tools, their fire. Both were valid answers to the same enormous, freezing question. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Some of your own ancestors are still quietly adapting, even now. Populations that have lived for many generations in extreme cold, certain Siberian and Arctic groups among them, carry genetic variations still present today, linked to more efficient fat metabolism and different patterns of body heat production, likely shaped by that same long relationship with brutal cold. Some of these variations affect how the body processes dietary fat, echoing in a strange and beautiful way that ancient Ice Age reliance on fat and marrow as the truest currency of survival. This means, in a small and very real sense, that the Ice Age never fully ended for human biology. It simply left quiet fingerprints, still readable in the genes of people living today, evidence of a cold so long and so demanding that it reshaped bodies at the level of DNA, not just behavior. Somewhere tonight, someone is sleeping soundly with a body still faintly echoing that ancient, frozen world without ever knowing it. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's rest for a moment on the animals who shared that world, because the Ice Age wasn't only cold. It was crowded with creatures far larger and far more dangerous than almost anything alive today. Cave bears, some significantly larger than modern grizzly bears, competed directly with humans for the very same caves that offered life-saving shelter from the cold. Cave lions, larger than any lion alive now, hunted across the same open plains where humans searched for food. Herds of woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses moved like living mountains across frozen grasslands, magnificent and genuinely lethal if provoked or cornered. Simply finding a dry, defensible place to sleep for the night could mean confronting or carefully avoiding an animal capable of killing a person in seconds. There was no locked door, no walls thick enough to guarantee safety, just fire, numbers, vigilance, and an enormous amount of accumulated, hard-won knowledge about which animals to avoid, which signs meant danger was near, and which sounds in the dark meant nothing at all. Tonight, wherever you are resting, nothing outside is large enough, or hungry enough, or close enough to threaten you in that way. The door is simply a door. Let that be one more small, quiet relief. There is something worth pausing on here, too. How differently sleep itself likely worked in that world. Some researchers who study surviving hunter-gatherer societies in cold or resource-scarce climates have noted patterns of sleep quite different from our own. Sometimes split into two segments through the night, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between, often spent tending the fire, talking softly, or simply resting without full sleep before drifting off again until dawn. Cold, the need to keep a fire alive, and the ever-present possibility of danger in the dark May have shaped this rhythm. Sleep as something more vigilant, more communal, less like the single deep block of rest you're likely settling into right now. There's something almost tender in imagining it. A small group wrapped together for warmth, waking briefly in the coldest hour of the night, feeding the fire, murmuring quietly to one another in the dark, before settling back down together until the pale gray edge of morning finally arrived. You don't need to keep watch tonight. Nothing needs tending while you sleep. You are allowed the luxury, and it is a genuine luxury, hard-won across tens of thousands of years, of simply closing your eyes and staying that way until morning. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's turn toward something quieter still. How sunlight itself became scarce and strange in that far north world. In the deep winters at higher latitudes, daylight itself could shrink dramatically. Some regions experiencing only a handful of hours of weak, pale sun each day for months at a stretch. This mattered for more than mood. Sunlight on skin helps the human body produce vitamin D, essential for strong bones and a functioning immune system, and its scarcity across long, dark winters likely posed a real, ongoing challenge. Some researchers believe this scarcity is part of why lighter skin tones evolved among populations that pushed deep into these far northern regions' skin that allows more of the limited available sunlight to be absorbed and converted. A slow evolutionary answer to a very long, very dark problem. Diet helped too. Fatty fish and animal livers, both rich in vitamin D, likely became especially important nutritional lifelines precisely because the sun itself could no longer be counted on. It's a strange thing to sit with, something as universal and constant as sunlight, something you likely never think twice about, was once scarce enough and important enough to help reshape human skin itself across the span of thousands of years. There is something else worth resting on for a moment: language and the invisible thread of knowledge it carried. None of what we've wandered through tonight, the fitted clothing, the tended fire, the mammoth hunting strategy, the knowledge of which plants healed and which poisoned, could have survived a single generation without something to carry it forward. Spoken language, patient teaching, careful storytelling, passed from old hands to young ones around the fire. A child in the Ice Age wasn't simply handed tools. They were handed decades, sometimes centuries, of accumulated trial and error, which stone fractured best into a sharp edge, which berries looked similar, but one was deadly. How to read the sky for a coming storm, how to move quietly enough to approach a herd without startling it. This knowledge was not written down anywhere. It lived only in memory and in the voices willing to repeat it patiently, again and again, until it took root in the next generation. This is, in its own way, a kind of quiet miracle equal to any of the physical survival skills we've wandered through tonight. That so much delicate, essential knowledge could be carried safely across tens of thousands of years, mouth to ear, fire to fire, without ever once being lost completely, until eventually, indirectly, distantly, some small fragment of it helped shape the world you're resting in right now. But that is only one small part of the story. Here's something a little more playful to rest your mind on, gently, before we start to slow down further. The mammoth steppe. The environment that stretched across huge portions of Ice Age Europe and Asia wasn't the frozen, empty wasteland you might picture. It was something scientists now call the mammoth steppe, a vast, cold, but surprisingly productive grassland ecosystem, drier than tundra, richer in grasses and herbs than you'd expect, capable of supporting enormous herds of mammoths, woolly rhinos, horses, bison, and reindeer, all at once, across huge stretches of open land. This ecosystem no longer exists anywhere on Earth in its original form. It was a unique combination of climate and geography that vanished as the ice retreated and the world warmed, transforming into the mix of forests, tundra, and grasslands we know today. In a real sense, an entire asterisk biome asterisk, not just a handful of species, has disappeared from the planet, which means the world we're describing tonight isn't only a frozen version of today's landscapes. It's something genuinely, irretrievably different, a whole ecological chapter of Earth's story that closed permanently once the ice began, slowly, to melt away. There is something quietly humbling in that. An entire kind of asterisk, place asterisk, gone. Not just cold, but a whole way the world used to arrange itself, resting now only in fossils, frozen carcasses pulled occasionally from thawing permafrost, and the patient work of scientists piecing it back together. Let's rest a moment longer on the deep cold of the ground itself, permafrost. Across huge portions of the Ice Age world, the ground beneath the surface remained frozen solid year-round, sometimes to depths of hundreds of feet, thawing only a shallow layer near the top during the brief summer. This permafrost shaped nearly everything about daily survival, where you could dig, whether you could bury the dead in the way you might wish to, how water moved or failed to move across the landscape. It also, strangely, became one of history's great accidental time capsules. The same permafrost that made life so difficult has, in the millennia since, preserved astonishing details of that vanished world. Entire mammoth carcasses found frozen so completely that their stomach contents, their last meals, could still be examined thousands of years later. Ancient plants preserved well enough to identify exactly what grew on the mammoth steppe. Even in rare cases, human remains preserved with soft tissue still intact. In a strange way, the very thing that made that world so hostile to survive in the ground beneath your feet is also, now, the reason we know so much about it at all. The cold that threatened life back, then quietly guarding the evidence of that life for us to find tens of thousands of years later. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's turn to something smaller in scale, but just as remarkable, the ordinary, everyday cleverness that made survival possible at all. Consider the simple act of storing food without refrigeration in any form we'd recognize. Ice Age humans still found ways to preserve meat for the lean months ahead, drying strips of it in cold, dry air, until it became lightweight and long-lasting, not unlike modern jerky, or burying portions in permafrost itself, using the endless natural cold as a kind of ancient freezer, retrievable weeks or months later when fresh food ran short. Consider, too, the ingenuity in tool-making. A single well-made stone blade, carefully napped through a skill that could take years to master, might be used, reused, resharpened, and passed down, representing hours of expert labor condensed into an object small enough to fit in a hand. Nothing was casually discarded. Everything, bone, sinew, hide, stone, fat, carried real value. And using it fully wasn't a virtue people congratulated themselves for. It was simply how you stayed alive. This is worth sitting with gently. Survival in that world wasn't one dramatic skill, like hunting alone. It was hundreds of small, quiet competencies, stacked patiently on top of one another, starting a fire, sewing a seam, reading a cloud, preserving a strip of meat. Each one small, each one utterly necessary, each one representing knowledge that took a very long time, across a very long history, for humanity to slowly gather. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Art, appearing in the middle of all this hardship, almost defiantly. Even amid the relentless demands of that frozen world, Ice Age humans still found time, energy, and reason to create. Deep inside caves across what's now France and Spain, painted tens of thousands of years ago by flickering torchlight, are extraordinarily detailed images of the very animals these humans depended on and feared. Horses, bison, mammoths, rendered with a skill and observational care that still genuinely astonishes people who see them today. Small carved figures, two animals, and stylized human forms, some among the oldest known sculptural art in existence, suggest a rich inner and communal life running alongside the daily grind of survival. This wasn't decoration in any casual sense. Creating this art, especially deep inside dark caves reachable only by careful, torchlit navigation, took real time, real resources, and real intention. It's a gentle, important reminder. Even in a world defined so heavily by cold, hunger, and danger, the human need to make meaning, to create beauty, to leave some mark beyond simple survival, was already fully present. Whatever quiet part of you tonight still wants to notice beauty, still wants to create, or imagine, or wonder, is a very, very old part of you indeed. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's turn more gently now toward the coastlines and rivers of that world, because not everyone survived the cold the same way. Groups living near coastlines, where the Ice Age world allowed it, often relied heavily on the sea itself, fishing and hunting seals and other marine mammals, which offered rich, reliable stores of fat, exactly the resource so desperately needed through the leanest months. Coastal environments, in some regions, may have offered slightly more stable food access than the deep interior, since the ocean's bounty didn't disappear the same way inland herds sometimes did. This mattered enormously for how and where humans were eventually able to survive and spread during this era. Following coastlines, rather than pushing directly through the harshest interior cold, may have offered a gentler, more survivable route for some populations moving into new territories. A slow, patient migration shaped as much by where food reliably existed as by any bold spirit of exploration. It's worth remembering, the story of the Ice Age wasn't one single strategy, repeated everywhere. It was hundreds of different small solutions, shaped by hundreds of different landscapes. Inland hunters chasing mammoth herds across frozen plains, coastal communities working the rhythms of the sea, each finding their own narrow, hard-won path through the same enormous cold. There is something else worth resting on, quieter still, cooperation itself as a kind of technology. No single person, however skilled, however strong, survived the Ice Age alone for long. Survival depended on groups sharing food when one person's hunt failed and another's succeeded, caring for children and elders who couldn't fully provide for themselves, tending fire through the night in shifts, passing skills between generations. This wasn't simply kindness, though it likely was that too. It was, in a very real sense, the single most important survival technology humanity ever developed, more essential, in the end, than any spear or fire or fitted coat. A person alone, however clever, faced impossible odds in that world. A group, however imperfect, could share the risk widely enough that the group itself, as a whole, could keep going even when individual members faltered. This is perhaps the quietest, gentlest truth buried inside everything we've wandered through tonight. You would not have survived the Ice Age alone, and neither would anyone else. Survival, from the very beginning, was something humans figured out how to do only together. But that is only one small part of the story. There's a smaller, thirstier truth worth pausing on here. Even surrounded by frozen water, staying hydrated in that world was its own quiet danger. It sounds strange, almost like a riddle. A world covered in ice and snow, and yet dehydration was a real and constant risk. Snow and ice don't simply melt into drinkable water on their own. Eating snow directly actually costs the body precious heat and energy as it works to warm and melt it internally. A poor trade in a world where every calorie was already scarce. Melting snow properly required fire, time, and fuel, none of which were ever guaranteed to be available in the moment thirst struck. This meant that even something as basic and automatic as drinking water, something you could do right now without a single thought, required planning, resources, and effort in that frozen world. A person moving quickly across open, icy terrain, away from any fire, could genuinely become dangerously dehydrated even while surrounded, quite literally, by more frozen water than they could ever need. There is something gently humbling in that image. Abundance and scarcity sitting side by side, the very thing you needed most visible everywhere, and yet almost entirely out of reach without exactly the right tools and effort to unlock it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Not every Ice Age human population adapted the same way, and some found astonishing solutions in the opposite direction, toward the sky rather than toward the cold. The Denisovans, a lesser-known relative of ours who lived across parts of Asia during this same era, appear to have thrived at extremely high altitudes, including regions of the Tibetan Plateau, among the most oxygen-thin, punishing environments on Earth. Modern Tibetan populations today still carry a specific gene inherited from these ancient Denisovan ancestors that helps the body use oxygen far more efficiently at high altitude, reducing the risks that usually come with life so far above sea level. This is a quietly remarkable thing to sit with. An entirely different ancient human population, facing an entirely different flavor of the same enormous problem. How to survive in a world trying, in its own way, to kill you, found their own distinct genetic answer, one that some people alive right now, sleeping soundly at high altitude as you rest here at whatever elevation you're at, still quietly carry inside them. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's turn towards something a little more unsettling, offered gently. The strange, disorienting way cold itself could confuse the mind before it ever stopped the body. In the later stages of severe hypothermia, something called paradoxical undressing sometimes occurs. A person, dangerously cold and confused, becomes convinced they are overheating and begins removing the very clothing that's keeping them alive. It happens because the body, in its final and most desperate attempt to protect its vital organs, redirects nearly all remaining warm blood inward, away from the skin. And this sudden rush of blood back toward the surface, in brief and fatal miscalculation, can trick the confused mind into feeling a burst of warmth precisely when the danger is greatest. It's a strange and sobering thing to picture. The cold not just weakening the body, but quietly, cruelly rewriting what the mind believes to be true, right at the most critical moment. Ice Age humans, who lived so close to the edge of this danger for so much of the year, would have needed not just physical toughness, but hard-won, communal knowledge of these warning signs, knowing to trust a companion who insisted they were fine, less than trusting the visible confusion in their eyes. Tonight, your body is not fighting any such confusion. There is no danger tricking your mind into anything. You are simply, safely, unremarkably warm, and allowed to trust that feeling completely. There is something warmer, gentler, worth resting on now, the quiet alliance that began forming sometime during this era between humans and wolves. Genetic evidence suggests that dogs began separating from wild wolf populations sometime during the Ice Age, likely tens of thousands of years ago, through a slow, mutual process rather than any single deliberate choice. Wolves less fearful of human camps drawn in by scraps and warmth. Humans slowly growing to value their presence as extra eyes, extra ears, and extra warning against danger in the dark. This early, tentative partnership, forged in the middle of one of the hardest environments humans have ever faced, would eventually become one of the most enduring relationships between humans and any other species on the planet. It's a small, tender thought to hold on to. Somewhere in that vast, freezing world, the earliest whispers of every dog curled up on a bed right now, every good and steady companion, were quietly beginning to take shape by a shared fire. But that is only one small part of the story. Here's something worth resting on gently. The truth that finding good stone for tools was its own quiet, constant labor, often stretching across enormous distances. Not every kind of rock makes a good blade. Certain fine-grained stones, like flint or obsidian, fracture in predictable, sharp-edged ways perfect for cutting and scraping, while most ordinary rock simply shatters uselessly because good tool-making stone wasn't available everywhere. Archaeological evidence shows these materials were often carried, traded, or specifically traveled toward across surprisingly long distances, sometimes hundreds of miles from their original source, passed carefully from group to group. This tells us something quietly important. Even in a world defined by daily survival, Ice Age humans maintained wide, patient networks of contact and exchange with other distant groups. Small, unremarkable objects, a particular seashell found far inland, a specific stone type recognized as coming from a known, distant source, suggest quiet, ongoing relationships stretching across huge portions of that ancient landscape, built and maintained not for convenience, but because survival itself sometimes depended on staying connected to people you might rarely, if ever, actually meet in person. There is something else worth resting on, closer to home this time. How the labor of that world left its own quiet signature on the human skeleton itself. Skeletal remains from across this era frequently show signs of significant physical wear, even in surprisingly young individuals. Joint damage consistent with what we'd now associate with people decades older. Evidence of repetitive, demanding physical strain from constant walking, carrying, hide scraping, and tool making, beginning often in early adolescence and continuing, without much relief, for the rest of a life. Modern humans, even those who exercise regularly, rarely place this same relentless daily physical demand on the body across an entire lifetime. Your joints tonight whatever small aches they carry, have very likely faced nothing close to the sustained, grinding labor an ice age body faced simply to get through an ordinary week. It's a strange kind of comfort, in its own way, permission to rest a body that, by ancient standards, has actually been asked to do remarkably little. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's rest a moment on light itself, specifically the small, flickering flames that let humans see in the deepest, darkest places on Earth. To paint those extraordinary images deep inside caves, artists needed light far from any entrance, in total, absolute darkness. Archaeologists have found small stone lamps from this era, shallow hollows carved into rock, filled with animal fat, fitted with a simple wick, capable of producing a small, steady flame for a surprisingly long stretch of time. Some show soot patterns suggesting they were refueled and relit repeatedly, session after session, as an artist returned again and again to the same deep chamber to continue their work. Imagine crouching in absolute blackness, hundreds of feet inside solid rock, the only light in the entire world coming from a small flame cupped in stone, fueled by the same precious animal fat that might otherwise have gone toward a meal. That choice alone, spending vital fat reserves on light for art rather than food for survival, says something quiet and remarkable about how deeply the impulse to create mattered. Even then, there is something else worth resting on, gentler still. How much of Ice Age survival likely depended on plants, and on knowledge that has left far less obvious evidence behind than a mammoth bone or a stone spear. While dramatic megafauna hunts tend to dominate our imagination of this era, most researchers now believe that gathered foods, roots, tubers, nuts, seeds, and edible plants, carefully identified and prepared, made up a very substantial, steady portion of the actual diet across much of the year, especially in seasons when large hunts were less successful or less possible. This knowledge, passed down mostly by word and demonstration, rather than any physical tool we can dig up and examine, required knowing exactly which plants were safe, which needed careful preparation to remove toxins, and which, deceptively similar in appearance, could kill. It's worth remembering, gently, that survival in that world wasn't only the dramatic image of the hunt. It was also this quieter, steadier knowledge, patient, detailed, passed carefully from one generation to the next, forming a reliable foundation beneath the more dramatic, uncertain business of chasing mammoths across a frozen plain. But that is only one small part of the story. One last small, wandering thought before we begin to settle fully. Much of this vast, frozen world was crossed not by choice alone, but by following a bridge that no longer exists. During the coldest stretches of the Ice Age, so much of Earth's water was locked into glacial ice that sea levels dropped dramatically, exposing a wide stretch of land connecting what is now Siberia to Alaska, a land bridge scientists call Beringia. For a window of thousands of years, this wasn't ocean at all, but open, walkable ground, grassy and cold, crossed slowly, likely over many generations, by small groups following herds of animals rather than any grand plan of discovery. This quiet, patient crossing, unhurried, generational, driven more by the movement of prey than any deliberate journey, eventually became the doorway through which humans first reached the Americas. It's a strange thing to hold in your mind. An entire hemisphere, reached not through some singular bold voyage, but through small, careful steps taken across land that has been underwater again for thousands of years now, entirely invisible beneath the waves of what's now the Bering Strait. There's a smaller, quieter thought worth resting on now. How differently the human hand itself was shaped by that world. Skeletal comparisons between Ice Age humans and people living today reveal a striking difference in bone density and strength, particularly in the hands and forearms, density more comparable to what we'd now expect from a highly trained modern athlete than an average adult. This wasn't the result of any deliberate exercise program. It was simply the accumulated effect of a life spent constantly gripping, scraping, carrying, and working hides, and stone, and wood by hand, hour after hour, day after day, for an entire lifetime beginning in childhood. Your own hands, resting quietly wherever they are right now, carry nowhere near that same density or demand. That isn't a failing. It's simply the natural result of a much gentler world, one where survival doesn't ask nearly as much of your grip, your forearms, your daily physical effort. Let your hands rest completely tonight, with nothing at all required of them until morning. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. How little privacy, in the modern sense, likely existed in that world at all. Small groups, huddled together through long, dangerous winters for warmth and safety, likely spent enormous stretches of time within arm's reach of one another, sleeping close, working close, eating close, day after day, season after season. The quiet, solitary stretch of time you might take for granted right now, alone with your own thoughts in a room with a closed door, may have been a genuinely rare luxury in that world, available only in brief, stolen moments. There's a strange kind of comfort in recognizing this. The quiet you're resting in tonight, private, undisturbed, entirely your own, is not a small thing. It's the product of an enormous amount of accumulated human progress, most of it slow and invisible, stretching all the way back to campfires, where solitude simply wasn't something anyone could expect or plan for. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's turn gently to something that might surprise you. Even a world defined so heavily by cold still had its brief, brutal season of heat and pests. Ice Age summers, especially near thawing wetlands and river valleys, could bring extraordinary swarms of biting insects, mosquitoes, and flies, breeding explosively in the brief warmth, sometimes in numbers dense enough, by some estimates, to genuinely threaten the well-being of both humans and the animals they depended on. Without any modern repellent or protective netting, groups likely relied on smoke from fires, certain plant materials, and simply enduring to get through the worst of these swarms each year. It's a small, almost funny detail tucked inside all this grand cold and hardship, that even in a world remembered mostly for its brutal winters, a fairly ordinary swarm of insects on a warm summer evening could still be its own distinct, exhausting misery, layered on top of everything else that world already demanded. There is something heavier, held gently, worth resting on here. How abruptly that world's climate could sometimes shift, even within a single human lifetime. Ice core records, drilled from ancient compressed snow in places like Greenland, reveal something unsettling. The climate during and after the deepest Ice Age cold didn't always change slowly and predictably. At certain points, most famously a period known as the Younger Dryas, roughly 12,000 years ago, temperatures appear to have plunged back into severe cold remarkably quickly, undoing what had seemed like a promising, gradual warming, and holding the world in renewed cold for well over 1,000 years before finally releasing it. For the people living through a shift like this, there would have been no scientific explanation available, no ice core data to consult, no chart to show that this was temporary. Just a world that seemed to be recovering, and then, mysteriously, wasn't a slow return to hardship that must have felt, to anyone living through it, less like scientific pattern and more like something being taken away. But that is only one small part of the story. There's a strange kind of arithmetic worth resting on now. How much the human brain itself cost, calorically, to keep running through all of this scarcity. The human brain, then as now, is extraordinarily expensive to operate, consuming roughly a fifth of the body's total energy at rest, despite being a comparatively small fraction of overall body weight. In a world already defined by seasonal starvation and constant physical demand, this made the brain, in a very literal sense, one of the most expensive organs a body could carry, a huge, ongoing caloric investment that had to be paid every single day, regardless of how lean the season had become. And yet, across the entire span of the Ice Age, that same expensive, demanding brain never appears to have shrunk or simplified in response to scarcity. If anything, the tools grew more refined, the art more elaborate, the social networks more complex, as if the enormous cost of that intelligence kept being judged, generation after generation, worth paying. Tonight, your own brain, the very one gently drifting toward sleep right now, is the direct, unbroken inheritance of that ancient, expensive bet. There's something gentler still, worth resting on before we begin to close. How thoroughly nothing at all went to waste once a large animal had finally been brought down. After a successful mammoth or bison hunt, virtually every part of the animal found some further use. Meat and fat for food, obviously, but also hide for clothing and shelter, sinew for thread and cordage, bone for needles, tools, and even building material, as we wandered through earlier tonight. Even smaller, easily overlooked parts, tendons, certain organs, specific bones suited for particular tools, carried their own distinct value, each one representing calories or labor too precious to simply discard. This wasn't thriftiness in the way we might use that word today. It was simply the honest arithmetic of a world where every single hard-won resource had to justify its use again and again, because there was no guarantee the next successful hunt would come soon, or come at all. Nothing wasted, because nothing could afford to be. There's a small, salty thought worth resting on here, something else you've likely never had to think twice about: salt. Away from coastlines, in the deep interior of that frozen world, salt could be genuinely difficult to come by, despite being essential for the human body to function properly. Some inland groups likely obtained enough through the blood and organ meat of the animals they hunted, without needing much additional salt on its own. But for others, especially those relying more heavily on plant foods, sourcing salt may have meant real, deliberate travel toward mineral deposits or salt licks, or careful trade with groups who had better access. It's a strange thing to picture. Something you can now buy in bulk for almost nothing, without a second thought, once representing a genuine, trackable resource worth planning a journey around. Tonight, whatever seasoning sits forgotten in your kitchen, unused and unremarkable, would once have been treated as something closer to treasure. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Even teeth, in that world, did double duty as tools. Dental evidence from this era frequently shows a very particular telltale pattern of wear, grooves, and heavy erosion, consistent with using the front teeth to grip, pull, and soften animal hides, a technique still used by some traditional communities today to help break down tough leather before working it further by hand. This wasn't occasional. The wear patterns suggest it was routine, repeated so often across a lifetime that it left a permanent, readable signature on the bone itself. It's an oddly intimate detail to sit with a body, using literally every available tool, including its own teeth, worn down slowly and permanently in service of staying warm. Your own teeth, tonight, are asked to do nothing more demanding than resting quietly behind closed lips. Let them. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's turn, gently, toward how that entire frozen world eventually, slowly, came undone. Because the great Ice Age megafauna didn't simply outlast their era. As the ice began its long retreat, and the climate slowly warmed, the very animals so many Ice Age humans depended on, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths, and others, began disappearing entirely, species by species, across a window of several thousand years. Researchers still debate the exact balance of causes. A warming, rapidly changing climate reshaping the grasslands these animals depended on, combined, in many cases, with increasing hunting pressure from increasingly skilled human populations, likely working together rather than either cause standing entirely alone. Whatever the precise balance, the outcome remains the same. The very world we've spent tonight wandering through, the mammoth steppe, the great cold-adapted giants, the bone houses and marrow feasts built around them, didn't fade gently. It ended relatively abruptly, in evolutionary terms, leaving behind only bones, tusks, and the occasional frozen carcass, along with the human descendants who depended on it, forced now to slowly reinvent an entirely different way of living in the different, warmer world left behind. There's something else worth resting on, quieter and more physical. Just how far an ordinary life was walked across that world without anyone thinking of it as remarkable at all. Following migrating herds, searching for good hunting ground, moving camp with the seasons, researchers estimate that some Ice Age groups likely covered many hundreds, even thousands of miles across a single year, almost entirely on foot, carrying children, tools, and supplies the entire way. This wasn't exercise, and it wasn't travel in the sense you might use that word now. It was simply how you found food, how you avoided danger, how you kept your group fed and warm as the seasons shifted beneath you. A single human lifetime in that world may well have covered a walking distance equivalent to circling the entire earth, done not for any single grand journey, but in thousands of small, necessary steps, season after season, year after year. Wherever you are resting right now, notice, just for a moment, how still you're allowed to be tonight, how nothing at all requires you to move. But that is only one small part of the story. There's a gentler, quieter thought worth resting on now. How differently sound itself must have moved through that world. No engines, no electricity humming behind the walls, No distant traffic, no notifications, none of the low, constant background noise that fills almost every modern night without you even noticing it anymore. Just wind and fire crackling low, and the occasional distant call of an animal somewhere out in the dark, and the quiet murmur of voices close beside you. Silence, real and complete, was far more available in that world than it likely is in yours, though it likely came bundled, always, with the low hum of vigilance, a quiet awareness of exactly what that depth of silence might also be hiding. If it's quiet where you are right now, let that quiet simply be quiet. Nothing is hiding in it. There's no vigilance required tonight, only rest, for as long as you'd like to stay here. There is one last small thought worth resting on, gentle and practical, before we let this all soften completely. How much thought and care went into simply keeping food safe until it was needed, beyond drying meat in cold air or burying it in permafrost. Some groups dug deliberate storage pits into frozen ground, lined and covered carefully, functioning almost like an ancient communal pantry, a place where the hard-won results of a good hunt or a successful gathering season could be kept safe from scavenging animals and slow decay alike, retrievable weeks or months later when the lean season inevitably arrived. Choosing where to dig, how deep, how to disguise or protect the site, all represented accumulated practical wisdom, passed down and refined the same patient way as everything else in that world. It's a small, steady thought to end this stretch of wandering on. So much of survival in that frozen world wasn't dramatic at all. It was this quiet planning, patient preparation, small acts of care for a future self or a future group who wouldn't arrive for weeks or months yet. Not unlike, in its own distant way, the quiet, patient act of simply letting yourself rest well tonight, so that tomorrow's version of you has a little more to work with. There's a quieter, more social thought worth resting on now. How those small, scattered Ice Age groups managed to stay connected across enormous distances, simply to keep their populations healthy. Genetic evidence suggests that Ice Age human groups were often quite small, sometimes just a few dozen people living and traveling together, which created a real, practical challenge across generations. Finding partners from outside the immediate group to keep the wider population healthy and genetically diverse. This likely meant maintaining deliberate, ongoing relationships with other distant bands, gathering periodically at agreed meeting places, exchanging not just goods and stories, but over time, people themselves, joining one group to another through marriage and kinship. These periodic gatherings, some researchers believe, may have been genuinely large by the standards of that world, multiple small bands converging briefly at a reliable seasonal resource, like a river crossing during a salmon run or a favorable pass during a migration, before dispersing again into smaller groups for the rest of the year. It's a lovely thing to picture, in its own way, brief, precious seasons of noise and company and connection, deliberately built into an otherwise quiet, scattered existence. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. A strange, small silver lining tucked inside all this hardship. Those same small, scattered populations were likely spared certain dangers that would only arrive much later. Many of history's most devastating epidemic diseases, the kind that swept through dense, settled populations again and again in later millennia, require large numbers of people living closely together to spread and sustain themselves. Ice Age humans, moving in small, dispersed, mobile groups, largely didn't provide these diseases the conditions they needed to take hold in the same way. This doesn't mean illness wasn't a serious threat. It certainly was, in the form of injury, infection, and localized outbreaks. But the specific, sweeping epidemic diseases that would later devastate much larger, settled agricultural societies simply hadn't yet found the crowded conditions they needed to thrive. It's a strange kind of balance to notice. A world so hard in so many ways, and yet quietly, accidentally protected from one particular category of danger that later, more advanced societies would eventually have to face instead. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's turn gently toward ornament and color. Because even amid all this hardship, Ice Age humans clearly cared, quite a lot, about how they presented themselves to one another. Archaeological sites across this era have yielded beads made from shell, ivory, and stone, along with red and yellow ochre pigment, sometimes found in quantities and contexts, suggesting it was used to decorate bodies, clothing, or tools, not merely for any single practical purpose. Some of these beads show wear patterns consistent with being strung and worn for extended periods, passed carefully from person to person, occasionally even placed deliberately with the dead. Researchers believe items like these may have functioned as a kind of visible social language, signaling identity, group membership, status, or connection to a particular distant community, readable at a glance by anyone who understood the code. In a world without written records, without photographs, without any of the ways you now might signal who you are to a stranger, a particular pattern of beads or a specific use of pigment may have quietly said, "This is who I am. This is where I come from. This is the group that will vouch for me." Even now, some small part of you likely still reaches for something similar, a particular color. a particular object, to say something about yourself without needing any words at all. There is one final, practical thought worth resting on here: how completely different your daily relationship with weather itself would have been. Right now, you likely know, roughly, what tomorrow holds: a forecast checked without thinking, a weather app glanced at for half a second. In the Ice Age, no such certainty existed. Every single day carried a small, unavoidable uncertainty about what the sky might do, an uncertainty that could mean the difference between a manageable hunt and a genuinely dangerous one, a safe journey to the next camp and a deadly one. Reading clouds, wind, animal behavior, and subtle shifts in temperature became a serious, essential skill, not idle curiosity, but a form of literacy nearly as important as knowing how to make fire or find water. You tonight don't need to read the sky for any warning at all. Whatever the weather is doing beyond your walls, it isn't a decision you need to make anything around right now. That, too, is a quiet kind of safety worth resting inside of, just for tonight. There's one more animal worth resting on before we begin to close. Not the mammoth this time, but the reindeer, quieter and smaller, yet just as essential to many groups living through the Ice Age. For communities across the colder northern reaches of that world, reindeer offered something the larger, rarer megafauna couldn't always guarantee: a more predictable, seasonally migrating source of meat, hide, and crucially, antler, a material lighter and more workable than the heavy bone of larger animals, ideal for crafting harpoon points, needles, and finely carved tools. Unlike tusks or heavy leg bones, antler could be shaped with real precision. And because reindeer shed and regrew their antlers naturally each year, it offered a renewable resource in a world where almost nothing else could be counted on to simply grow back. Following reindeer herds along their seasonal migration became, for some groups, less a single dramatic hunt and more an ongoing, patient relationship stretched across an entire year, arriving where the herd was expected, gathering what was needed, then moving on again as the animals themselves moved on. It's a gentler image than the mammoth hunt in its way. Survival built not around one enormous risk, but around steady, repeated, patient timing. There is something tender worth resting on here, held gently. How differently early motherhood likely unfolded in that world. Evidence from comparable hunter-gatherer societies suggests that Ice Age mothers likely nursed their children for a long stretch of early childhood, often several years, longer than is typical in much of the world today. This extended nursing period may have served more than one purpose at once: providing steady nutrition in a world where reliable food for a very young child couldn't always be guaranteed elsewhere, while also naturally spacing births further apart. giving each child a longer stretch of undivided care before the next arrived. It's worth imagining gently just how much sustained physical closeness this would have meant across those early years. Constant carrying, constant nearness, an entire early childhood spent almost never far from a mother's body at all, in a world where warmth, safety, and survival were often the very same thing. But that is only one small part of the story. Let's rest, finally, on the dark itself, because fear of it, in that world, wasn't irrational at all. It was simply accurate. Nightfall meant reduced visibility exactly when some of the most dangerous predators of that era were most active. And it meant the fire, however carefully tended, eventually burned low. It's easy to imagine that this nightly vulnerability shaped more than just behavior. Some researchers believe it may have shaped storytelling itself as a way of processing and managing that fear collectively. Voices low around a fire, turning a shared, reasonable dread into something communal, something survivable, something that could even, eventually, become comforting rather than paralyzing. In a strange way, this may be one of the oldest uses of a story, exactly like the one you're listening to right now, not to teach a fact, but to sit beside fear, gently, with a warm voice and steady company, until it softens into something you can finally rest inside of. There is one last, quiet thought worth resting on before we let all of this go completely. Everything we've wandered through tonight, the cold, the hunger, the fire so carefully guarded, the bone houses, the long walks, the small ornaments carrying unspoken meaning. None of it was endured for its own sake. It was endured patiently, generation after generation, for exactly this, a future where someone, eventually, wouldn't have to endure it anymore, where warmth could simply exist without tending, where food could simply be there without a hunt, where a door could simply close, keeping the whole cold, dangerous night safely outside. That future is this one, right now. Wherever you're resting, however ordinary tonight might feel to you, it is the quiet, accumulated result of an almost unimaginable amount of effort, spread across tens of thousands of years, by people who never got to see how it would eventually turn out. There's one more practical thought worth resting on: how much of daily life in that world was quietly devoted simply to maintenance. A single fitted fur garment, worn daily through months of hard use, wind, and repeated freezing and thawing, wouldn't stay intact on its own. Seams loosened, hide grew brittle or cracked, sinew thread wore thin and snapped. Keeping a family properly clothed through an entire winter wasn't a task completed once, in autumn, and then forgotten. It was an ongoing, quiet labor, stretched across the whole cold season, mending and resewing by firelight, again and again, simply to keep the one barrier between skin and killing cold, intact, and reliable. There's something almost meditative in imagining it, hands working steadily by low firelight, night after night, at a task that was never really finished, only ever kept just barely ahead of falling apart. Nothing in that world stayed fixed once and remained fixed forever. Everything needed tending, again and again, the same patient way fire needed tending, the same patient way trust between people needed tending, the same patient way, in its own much gentler form. Your own body is tending itself right now, quietly, without you needing to do anything at all. There is something else worth resting on, held gently. A small, easily overlooked danger tucked inside something as ordinary as a meal. Eating meat that hadn't been thoroughly cooked. Sometimes a necessity, in moments when fuel was scarce, or a hunt had to be eaten quickly before it spoiled, carried real risk of parasitic infection, including from organisms that could cause serious, sometimes fatal illness weeks after the meal itself was long forgotten. Without any way to test meat for safety beyond experience and caution, groups relied on hard-won collective knowledge. Which animals carried greater risk, which parts were safer, how thoroughly something truly needed to be cooked, refined slowly, sometimes at real cost, across many generations. It's a small, sobering reminder that even the most basic act of eating, something you likely do several times a day without a flicker of worry, once carried its own quiet, invisible risk, patiently managed rather than ever fully eliminated. But that is only one small part of the story. There is one final, gentle thought worth resting on before we let everything soften completely. How differently warmth itself moved in that world compared to the warmth surrounding you right now. Inside whatever shelter you're resting in tonight, warmth is likely simply present, even, steady, filling the whole space without much effort or attention from you at all. In an Ice Age shelter, warmth was never even or guaranteed. It radiated unevenly from a single fire, strongest close by, fading quickly toward the edges, meaning where exactly you slept, how close to the flame, how tightly you curled against another body for shared heat, mattered enormously, every single night, in a way that simply choosing where to lie down in your own bed right now does not. There is real, quiet luxury in that difference, worth noticing gently before we close. You don't need to negotiate your place near the fire tonight. You don't need to curl close to anyone for survival's sake. The warmth around you now is simply, evenly, reliably there, asking nothing of you at all, in every corner of wherever you're resting. There's one last quiet thought worth resting on before we let this all go. How the passing of an adult not just a child, was carried and marked in that world. Burial sites from across this era show real, deliberate care extended to the dead more broadly. Bodies arranged carefully, sometimes accompanied by tools, ornaments, or red ochre pigment, sometimes positioned in ways that suggest real ritual thought rather than simple, practical disposal. This mattered, likely, for more than sentiment alone. In small, tightly interdependent groups, the loss of a single skilled adult, a toolmaker, a tracker, someone who remembered which plants could heal and which could kill, represented a real, practical loss of accumulated knowledge, on top of whatever grief the group itself carried. And yet the evidence still points toward grief, clearly, tenderly, rather than mere practicality, objects placed with real care, positioning that speaks of intention rather than haste. It's a quiet, steady reminder that carries all the way to tonight. However different that ancient world was from your own, in almost every visible way, the simple human instinct to mark a loss with care, to refuse to let it pass entirely unmarked, was already fully, unmistakably present. There is one more small comfort worth resting on, gentle and specific, before we finally begin to close completely. How much of what kept people safe through that whole long, cold era was never dramatic at all. It was simply attention, noticing a shift in wind, noticing a companion growing too quiet, too confused in the cold, noticing which patch of ground held snow a little differently, suggesting thinner ice below. Small, unglamorous, endlessly repeated acts of paying attention, carried out patiently by ordinary people who mostly never thought of themselves as remarkable at all. You don't need that same vigilance tonight. You're allowed, fully and completely, to let your attention go slack, to stop noticing anything at all, to trust that nothing tonight requires the kind of careful watching that once, for so long, meant the difference between waking up and not. One very last small thought before we let it all rest. How strange and how fitting it is that a story like this one can even reach you at all. Everything we've wandered through tonight survives only because someone, somewhere, chose to notice it, preserve it, or carefully piece it back together. A frozen mammoth thawing slowly out of permafrost after tens of thousands of years. A scatter of beads cataloged patiently in a museum drawer. A bone needle small enough to lose in a pocket, examined instead with real care under careful light. None of this had to survive. Most of what existed in that world didn't. What's left is only ever a fragment, a faint outline of something enormous, glimpsed through the narrow gaps that happened, by chance, to let a little light through across all that time. In a way, that's not so different from what's happening right now, between this quiet voice and your own tired mind, a fragment of something very old, carried carefully across a very long distance, offered gently into a dark, quiet room, asking nothing of you except permission to simply be received softly before it drifts away again into rest. We're nearing the end of our wandering now, so let's let the pace soften, the way a long walk naturally slows near its final stretch. Think, for a moment, of everything we've touched tonight. The cold that would find your skin in minutes, the fire that had to be earned and guarded and never let to die, the needle, tiny and patient, sowing warmth from animal hide, the hunger of late winter and the strange, essential value of fat and marrow, the enormous, dangerous hunts undertaken not for glory but for survival, the bone houses built from the very animals that fed them, the children lost too often and loved no less for it, the bodies slowly, patiently reshaped by cold across hundreds of thousands of years, the art painted deep in the dark, simply because something in us needed to make it, the quiet, constant cooperation that made any of this survivable at all. None of it happened quickly. None of it happened alone. And all of it somehow, eventually, led here, to this quiet room, this soft place to rest, this simple, unremarkable, miraculous fact that you are warm and fed and safe enough tonight to simply close your eyes. You don't need to hold onto any of these details. Let them soften now, the way mist softens a shoreline. There's no need to remember the mammoth step, or the bone needles, or the names of any ancient creatures. Just let the general shape of it settle somewhere quiet in you, a sense of how far you've come, how much has already been survived on your behalf, long before you ever arrived. Let your body take back over now. Let your breathing slow further, the way it wants to. Let your shoulders sink a little deeper into whatever is holding you. Let the last small tensions of the day finish loosening, one by one, without needing your help. Your mind, all day, has simply been trying to make sense of things, predicting, sorting, preparing, the way it always does. That's all it was ever doing, even tonight, even with all of this. It doesn't need to solve anything else right now. It's allowed to stop. Above you, whether you can see it tonight or not, the same sky that once stretched over frozen mammoth steppes still stretches on, steady and enormous and endlessly patient. It has watched ice ages come and watched them go, and it will keep turning gently long after tonight, long after tomorrow, asking nothing of you at all. You don't have to keep watch. You don't have to tend the fire. You don't have to hunt or sow or carry anything forward tonight except your own soft, tired, well-earned rest. Your body already knows how to rest. Sleep well and good night.